Hello, I want to spend a little bit of time going over the ecological crisis, some political psychological aspects of it, and then some climate denialism, really more like soft climate denialism, plus a little bit of harder climate denialism, and try to tie them all together. So let me just start by reiterating that the ecological crisis is not the same as climate change. The ecological crisis encompasses a larger number of problems, threats really, that we face, and climate change is just one of them. So let me show you this. This is from a recent paper in Science Advances discussing the concepts of planetary boundaries. So when people talk about the ecological crisis, they're not only talking about climate change or global warming. That's certainly one of the major aspects, perhaps one of the most threatening ones, but it's not the only one. We've got ocean acidification, which is getting very close to the planetary boundary outside of our safe operating space. Biogeochemical flows, that's phosphorus and nitrogen pollution coming up from runoff from industrial agriculture, freshwater change, land system change, deforestation, etc. Biosphere integrity, we're losing massive amounts of species. We're in an extinction event. We do have climate change as well. That's part of it, a huge part of it. Novel entities, microplastics, all of the various chemicals that we've released into the environment, and so on. So I just want to make clear the rest of the video is going to be on various forms of climate denial. But keep in mind, the ecological crisis is much broader than just climate change or global warming. And that's really useful to acknowledge, because a lot of the people that you see criticizing or denying climate science, or rather, not, I guess to be more precise, not taking into account that we need to be thinking in terms of risks, not certainties. And that will come across, I think, in my presentation here. It's very important to keep in mind that climate change is not the only threat. It's one component of the broader ecological crisis. Now I'm going to show you some clips from an interview with Steve Koonin, who's a physicist who relatively recently engaged in a review of climate science with a few climate scientists, also a few people in the very small minority of dissenters from the climate consensus. But leaving that aside, elsewhere in the interview, he says that his recent book got unfair reviews, and there was a lot of ad hominem attacks directed at him. I looked around at a few reviews, and I didn't see many ad hominem attacks. But this review I want to show you, I think, summarizes what I think are the significant problems in his approach, in his thinking. So let me show you this review here. So this review comes from the website Debunking Denial. And I'm just going to point out one small part of it. If you're interested, please feel free to read the full review. It's pretty easy to find. But I think this point really resonated with my takeaway from his interview. And that is they point out that, conspiracy theorists tend to do too much dot connecting. They take one event here, one relationship there, and then they take far too much from those bits of evidence and weave them into a story that's not really well supported by that evidence. And they point out Koonin basically does the opposite. It's like his tolerance for epistemic risk, like his ability or desire to not have absolute certainty. It seems like he's very high in need for cognitive closure. He wants to have absolute certainty about whatever he believes is going on in reality. So the way he approaches the climate science is setting an extremely high bar for certainty, which is foolish primarily because we're dealing with a complex system, and everything that we know about complex systems is that they're extremely hard to predict perfectly accurately. So the standard for evidence, as these reviewers of the book point out, would reasonably be lower. You would look at all of these different pieces of evidence, know that you don't have an absolutely perfect theory with an absolutely perfect model that can predict down to a square foot exactly what the temperature or weather will be 15 years from now. That is an unrealistic standard. And instead, what they're saying is what Kunin should do is look at all of these disparate pieces of evidence and accept the most likely explanation, which is that we're heading towards uncharted territory with a lot of risks. So forget about certainties. There's no such thing as a perfect certainty when you're dealing with a complex system, but you do have appreciable, understandable risks. And the problem with his analysis is he's basically saying, I need to have a standard of proof that's way up here, that's essentially impossible given the state of our current science, and perhaps impossible ever, given that, again, we're dealing with a massive complex system here in terms of the Earth's climate. He's saying we need to have this standard up here before we even really act in response to measurable, appreciable risks. So we need to be thinking in terms of risk, but that's not what Kunin is doing here. He's thinking, well, do we have certainty about what is going to happen? Aha, we don't have 100% certainty. Therefore, we really shouldn't do too much right now. So that's really the nature of this critique of his book. It's not mean-spirited. There are no ad hominem attacks contra what he has said about his critics. Perhaps elsewhere there have been such attacks, but I recommend this review for a good understanding of how Kunin's thinking gets him to this kind of lack of appreciation for the very serious risks we're facing. Now, before I get into some clips from his interview, I want to explain a little bit about a concept in political psychology called solution aversion. So I'm going to show you a paper on this topic and explain a little bit about it. So solution aversion is basically just a process by which we're presented with a problem, and then we're also presented with a solution to that problem. But if the solution to the problem that we're presented with goes against our previous beliefs, our ideology, then what we tend to do is not just say, oh, the solution is bad, we should find another one. We are also motivated to deny that the problem exists in the first place. Now, for those of you who have studied psychology, this probably won't come as much of a surprise. The way that our brain works, we experience an uncomfortable feeling called cognitive dissonance whenever we have two contradictory ideas in our heads. We have to try to find a way to resolve that contradiction. And what seems to happen when we're presented with solutions that contradict our ideology is that instead of trying to look for a different solution, we tend to deny the existence of the problem that the solution was intended to solve. So let's just look at what they did in this paper. They presented participants with a problem, and they framed the problem in or rather, they framed the solution in a different way. So in this first experiment, they presented Democrats and Republicans with information about climate change. And then in one condition, people are randomly selected into two conditions. One condition, they're told that the solution to climate change is something that's compatible with the free market, that we can use carbon taxes and other market mechanisms, and we can solve the problem of climate change through pro-market solutions. In the other condition, they're told that we need to have government regulation, direct government intervention into the economy. And as you can see from the graph here, when presented with the solution in the form of government regulation, which goes against free market ideology, the Republicans in this experiment were more likely to deny, not that that's a good solution and we should find another one, but more likely to deny that humans are causing climate change. So this is an obvious logical error, but in psychology, there are dozens of examples, if not more, of where we commit all sorts of logical errors because our brains did not evolve to make us perfect logical beings. They evolved for helping us survive and that's what they do. Of course, they don't work very well in a radically changed environment like we live in today versus 100,000 years ago. Here's another example. This is agreement with climate change science. So again, when presented with a free market friendly solution, Republicans were likely to say, yes, climate change science is accurate. But when presented with a solution that goes against free market ideology, then Republicans were more likely to deny that climate change even is accurate, that climate change science is accurate. Another example. Here's agreement with the environmental science on pollution. They picked this because they thought, okay, well, maybe climate change is just too polarized and that's what is causing this. But no, even just agreement with environmental science on the bad health effects of pollution, people who are higher in free market ideology were less likely to agree when the solution was presented as government regulation, something against the free market. That is, they were less likely to agree with environmental science that pollution has harmful health effects, not that they were less likely to agree with government regulation as the solution. That is the core of solution aversion, that our aversion to the solution makes us think less carefully or less logically about the very problem that the solution is meant to address. And lastly, they tested an issue that they expected would be, have kind of opposite effects. You would see the same solution aversion among Democrats or liberals in the U.S. versus conservatives. And so they asked them about the severity of intruder violence, people breaking into your house to commit a crime. And when they found, when they were presented with an anti-gun control solution, people who support gun control then said that intruder violence is just less of a problem. But when they were presented with a gun control friendly solution, that is, gun control would actually help reduce the severity of intruder violence, then they were more likely to say, yes, actually, intruder violence is a significant problem. In fact, they said it was a greater problem than even gun rights supporters in both conditions. So this is solution aversion. It's an irrational, illogical aspect of how our brains work, where if we're presented with a problem that needs to be solved, but the solution that we're given goes against our ideological beliefs, our beliefs about how the world works, how it should work, what is the good, etc., then instead of saying, okay, this is still a problem, I need to evaluate the evidence of the problem separately from my evaluation of a solution to the problem, that's not what our brains do. Instead, they tend to say, you know what, that problem isn't real at all anyway, because the solution makes us feel uncomfortable. It gives us cognitive dissonance. It conflicts with our beliefs about how the world should be ordered. So that's the problem with solution aversion. And now I'm going to demonstrate how that seems to be working in the thinking of two climate denialists. I guess you could call Kunin a kind of soft climate denialist. And the second speaker I'm going to show you is more of a hard climate denialist.
You think that you're right and most of the other experts in climate science are wrong.
So my own thoughts are informed by what are the economic damage estimates in the U.S. climate assessments in the IPCC. And I think my question back to the scientists were, are those wrong?
So what Steve Kunin is saying there is that the reason why he thinks that he's right on the climate science and the majority of climate scientists are wrong is that he takes seriously the IPCC's economic estimates of the effects of climate change versus the costs. And he says, are they wrong? And the simple answer to that is yes, they very much are wrong. There are many critics of the neoclassical economists that have contributed to estimates of the cost of climate change. But look up Steve Keen. He's probably one of the leading critics. He points out that I think William Nordhaus, the guy that won the Bank of Sweden Prize in economic science, which is false, inaccurately called the Nobel Prize in economics. There is no Nobel Prize in economics, but the Bank of Sweden created this prize to kind of mimic the Nobel Prize. Anyway, he got that Bank of Sweden prize for his work on modeling the costs of climate change. And one of the most egregious flaws in his research was he basically looked for correlations between currently existing temperatures around the world and I think GDP per capita. So he says, oh, okay, well, we can see that in cooler regions of the world, there tends to be higher GDP per capita. And so we can kind of use this correlation to say for each, you know, 0.1 degree temperature increase, we would expect to see a X% decrease in GDP per capita. Now, I think to most thinking people, this is obvious why this is just an absolutely absurd thing to do. First of all, climate change is not linear. Its effects aren't linear. That's what he's assuming. Second of all, to look around the world today and then tie the GDP per capita in a cold country like Norway to the GDP per capita in a hot country like Honduras, and then in your reasoning kind of implicitly assume that the differences in GDP can be meaningfully traced to temperature, and that as temperature rises, it's not that big of a deal because, you know, you can just do production indoors with air conditioning. It just bespeaks a staggering ignorance of the climate science on the risks, not the certainties, the risks of global warming and climate change. So this is not, you know, the as kind of strong evidence of the ideology in Steve Koonen's mind, as I'll show for the next speaker, but it does indicate a kind of belief system in which the status quo is fundamentally good. Lots of good things have come of it. I'll show a clip to that effect towards the end. But also just a lack of critical thinking when it comes to the products of the neoclassical school of economics. And certainly, without any doubt, total ignorance of the very powerful critiques of those modeling exercises that give us these laughably low estimates of the cost of climate change based on existing correlations over the past, several decades. So here is Steve Koonin in an interview with the Hoover Institution's Peter something or other. The Hoover Institution at Stanford University is a fairly right-wing kind of think tank, somewhat disconnected from Stanford. Leaving it aside, let's just listen to what Koonin has to say here.
You now, Steve. I'm a scientist. I work to understand the world through measurements and observations. I came away from the workshop not only surprised, but shaken by the realization that climate science was far less mature than I had supposed, close quote. Well, let's start with the end of that. What had you supposed?
Well, I had supposed that humans were warming the globe. Carbon dioxide was accumulating in the atmosphere, causing all kinds of trouble, melting ice caps, warming oceans, and so on. And the data didn't support a lot of that, and the projections of what would happen in the future relied on models that were, let's say, shaky at best.
All right.
So this is what I was talking about in reference to that critical review of his book in Debunking Denial, that essentially what he seems to be doing is applying impossibly strict evidentiary standards for climate change, climate science, particularly as regards risks. The whole domain we're in, because we're talking about a complex system, has to be thought of in terms of risks, not certainties. But essentially what he's doing is demanding certainties, like you might reasonably expect in physics research, where you can do experiments with super colliders and measure the effects of smashing atomic particles into each other at high speeds and measure exactly how the different pieces go. You get a much higher degree of exactitude and certainty in physics compared to climate change, because climate science is at a much higher level of complexity than physics. Physics is at the very basis of our reality. Goes up to chemistry, biology, And by the time you get to climate science, you're dealing with many factors in this complex system. So it's absurd to expect the degree of certainty you would be able to obtain in physics. But that seems to be the core of the problem here, that he's expecting a kind of physics level degree of certainty in climate science, where it doesn't really apply at all. And instead, we should be thinking of ranges of possibilities. And if within those ranges of possibilities include significant risks, significant threats, then we have to act accordingly. So let's continue and listen to another short clip. Here we go.
When you read those reports, they're massive. The latest one is 3,000 pages, and it took 300 scientists a couple of years to write. And you really need to be a scientist to understand them. Even I, as I started to dig into climate science, I got a background in theoretical physics. I can understand this stuff. It took me a couple years to really understand what goes on. Now, Ambassador Kerry, other politicians certainly have not done that.
So we have a theoretical physicist who spends 3 years reading up on climate science. And what seems to have happened is he takes his evidentiary standards, his standards for proof from physics, and then applies them to climate science, which is a fundamental mistake. You're dealing with a much more complex system. To get into the complex system bit, so you had a lot of scientists who 100 years ago or so would think that nature works like a machine. You know, humans at that point had created incredible machines, and it's mind-blowing what we were able to do by building machines for various purposes. So it makes sense that a natural metaphor we would use to try to understand nature is to think, oh, nature is like a giant machine. We can understand nature in the way that we understand the machines that we build. Sometime later, through mathematicians exploring chaos theory, ecologists developing a body of ideas about complex systems, a better understanding of how ecological systems work, you have a class of systems called complex systems, where you cannot predict a future state of that system without impossibly precise measurements of every single tiny component. Why? Because in these kinds of systems, a tiny perturbation in one aspect of the system can have massive consequences down the road in another aspect. So you might have heard of this phenomenon with the story of a butterfly flaps its wings in Bali, and there's a rainstorm in Canada the next week as a result. That kind of captures the dynamics of complex systems. So if you are entering into climate science with the expectation that your evidentiary standards are going to be equivalent to those in physics, which is fundamentally a more simple science because it's dealing with a more fundamental level of reality, that's going to be a problem. And let's continue.
Meant to do the summary for policymakers. And that gets drafted and passed by the scientists for comment. Some of them grumble, okay? But in the end, it's the governments who have approved the summary for policymakers, line by line. And that's where the disconnect happens. Right. First disconnect. I'll give you an example.
Please.
All right? So you look at the most recent report, and the summary for policymakers is talking about deaths from extreme heat, incremental deaths. And it says that, extreme heat or heat waves have contributed to mortality. Okay? And that's a true statement. But what they forgot to tell you was that the warming of the planet decreased the incidence of extreme cold events. And since 9 times as many people around the globe die from extreme cold than from extreme heat, the warming from the planet has actually cut the number of deaths from extreme temperatures by a lot.
And that doesn't...
So what you have here is 2 things. One, he's talking about the summary for policymakers in the IPCC report, and he points out accurately that governments, the representatives of governments, have the final say in that summary. The predominant critique by climate scientists of that aspect of the IPCC's procedures is that governments, because they are susceptible to pressure from extremely powerful fossil fuel companies, end up toning down the summary for policymakers to make the risks seem less worrisome. But he doesn't bring up that critique from climate scientists themselves. Then the example that he gives is kind of painfully dumb. I'll explain why. He's saying, okay, the IPCC report summary says that increasing temperatures are linked with increasing deaths due to heat stress. Well, yes, of course, that's one thing that we would expect from global warming, but it's probably at the very bottom of the list of what we're concerned about. We're concerned about massive disruption to climate affecting crop production, forcing mass migrations of people when there are droughts and heat waves and flooding, etc. All of these things contributing to social instability, which can then provoke war. So that's the probably at the top of the list of things we're concerned about. Of course, down the road, we're also concerned about perturbing our climate system into a state that is radically different from today and potentially can provoke complete societal collapse. That's at the lower end, depending on your time frame of likelihood. Nonetheless, if there's a small percentage chance of an extremely high risk, that's something to take seriously, right? So he brings up this thing that is at the very bottom of the list of concerns and says, well, yeah, more people are dying because of heat stress, but fewer people are dying from extreme cold. So, in the end, it's kind of net, it's a wash. No big problem. Well, that's missing the point entirely. Like, sure, if global average temperatures go up, fewer people are going to die from extreme cold. But that's not even a drop in the bucket. It's a half a drop in the bucket compared to the serious, really existential risks that we're facing. So it's really a red herring here to say, oh, the whole process is corrupted by governments, or rather the process of creating the IPCC summary is corrupted by governments, because here's this example of they didn't mention a positive side effect of global warming. Well, the positive side effect is a drop in the bucket or half a drop in the bucket. So who cares if they exclude that or not? And then you could see the relief on the face of this other Peter. I'm sorry, I forget his last name. When he hears this, he kind of closes his eyes in relief, a feeling of almost pleasure to not have this worry, which is connected to a required change in system, a system which he enjoys and thinks is a good economic system. So you can see kind of solution aversion working in real time here, where he sees this critique, he hears this critique of the IPCC reports, and regardless of whether it's a good or bad critique, he just feels a wave of relief that, oh, wait, we really don't have good evidence to push for the solutions that I don't want to see happen. Anyway, let's continue.
You get Kerry saying that, you get the Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, saying we're on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator.
And these statements are preposterous.
Yes, of course they are, okay? Even by the IPCC reports, they're preposterous. The climate scientists are negligent for not speaking up and saying that's preposterous.
Oh.
And again, after that, you can see the relief in the other Peter's face. Oh, thank God, these claims are preposterous. But again, this is what's going on here. He quotes UN Secretary General Guterres saying that we're on a highway to climate hell and we've got our foot on the accelerator. And he says that's a preposterous statement. Even the IPCC report itself would cast that as a preposterous statement. Again, the problem is he's applying these impossibly strict standards for evidence and not thinking in terms of appreciable, serious risk. Risk is not certainty. It's kind of baffling for me. I guess it's somewhat understandable when you're very confident in your kind of approach to science, being a physicist, and having a certain standard of evidence that you expect for all scientific pursuits, and then seeing, we don't have certainty, we just have ranges of probabilities, and within those ranges of probabilities include we are on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. But he would say, well, we don't have certainty about that, so therefore it's a preposterous statement. Well, it's not a preposterous statement if you know how to think in terms of risk. If you work for an insurance company, you would recognize that's not a preposterous statement. I'm used to thinking in terms of risk. I don't think in terms of certainty. If everyone agrees that driving drunk carries an extremely high risk of serious bodily harm. Now, if I drink a bottle of whiskey now and go drive 100 kilometers away, and I survive, I make it, does that mean that there's no risk whatsoever? Of course not. That's foolish. Everyone would understand that even if I drove safely from point A to point B after drinking an entire bottle of whiskey, that doesn't mean that wasn't a highly risky thing to do. It just means I got lucky. If the true risks of doing that were, say, a 50% chance of death, let's just posit that. The fact that we're talking in percentages implies that, yes, there is also a chance that we drive from point A to point B without dying, even though we're extremely drunk. That's precisely the kind of thinking he's not engaged in here. We have good evidence that we are in an extremely risky state by continuing to use fossil fuels. One of the possible risks is climate hell, as Gutierrez put it. So that's an extremely important part to get. And Steve here just does not seem to be able to engage in this kind of thinking about risk in a fundamentally uncertain environment. It's like he wants to have the same level of certainty you can get in physics, but in climate science, dealing with this mother of all complex systems, which is the climate.
And in the latest generation of models, about 40% of them were deemed to be too sensitive to be of much use.
Sensitive.
That's right. Namely, you add the carbon dioxide in and the temperature goes up too fast, okay, compared to what we've seen already. All right? So that's really disheartening. Those best models try as they can, they get it very wrong at least 40% of the time.
Okay.
Now, this is not only my assessment. You can look at papers by Harr and Bjorn Stevens, who are serious in the consensus, and make their own numbers. These models are not, at least at the regional or more detailed level.
Now, do you think this other Peter got that last point, that these other two climate scientists say that current models are not fit for purpose, asterisk, at least at the regional level? I don't think he got that. He was too busy feeling this wave of relief that the proposed changes to our economic system demanded by climate science don't actually need to be done because climate science is largely bunk. That seems to be what's going on in his head. I don't think he got the nuance. Let me show you some papers on this very topic. So the impression you probably got from Steve here is that climate models are full of problems. They're just not fit for purpose, as he said. And you might not have really got the whole regional level thing. Who cares about that? Clearly, here's a very intelligent scientist, a physicist, who has evaluated climate science, and he has concluded, along with, as he mentioned, climate scientists in the consensus, that our models are poor. So here's a recent paper reviewing the performance of past climate model projections. Now, you would expect from what Steve said that the finding would be, wow, we've got all sorts of massive problems with our climate models. But what they did is they looked at a whole bunch of climate models from the 1970s and 80s, I believe 90s as well. And here's their conclusion. In general, past climate model projections evaluated in this analysis were skillful in predicting subsequent warming. Some models showed too much warming, a few showed too little. But most models examined showed warming consistent with observations. And they point out the projection skill of the 1970s models is particularly impressive, given the limited observational evidence of warming at the time, because at the time, the world was thought to have been cooling for the past few decades. So that gives you a very different impression of the state of climate modeling than what Steve just said. So let's get into what he said more specifically. So this is the paper that he's referring to. He mentioned Tim Palmer and Bjorn Stevens. So here's a paper they wrote in PNAS on the state of climate models and some of the difficulties that we have with climate models. Right at the beginning of the paper, they say, we are certainly not claiming that model inadequacies cast doubt on well-settled issues, basically that humans have been the main driver of recent global warming and that this is a serious, worrisome issue. They continue, we're claiming that by de-emphasizing what our models failed to do, we contribute to complacency about the state of modeling. And then the reason why that is important is they say, this leaves the scientific consensus on climate change vulnerable to specious arguments that prey on obvious model deficiencies. Well, that is, in effect, exactly what's going on in practice with Steve Koonen's argument. He's presenting to his audience, a conservative audience that doesn't want to believe that climate science is accurate. He's presenting them with what they will interpret as a specious argument. They won't recognize it as specious, but what they're going to take away from that is, oh, climate models are all completely wrong. They're too sensitive. So we can just disregard climate science and continue on with business as usual without any sort of problem. Here's the key line where they say it's not fit for purpose. They say, for many key applications that require regional climate model output, we believe that the current generation of models is not fit for purpose, or for assessing large-scale changes from small-scale processes. Well, that is what I was trying to get at with the whole problem of complex systems and chaotic dynamics. If you have a complex system, which the climate is very much a complex system, you need impossibly accurate measurements in order to predict future states of it. What they're saying here is that our existing climate models cannot do a good job of predicting regional effects, which would be a really helpful thing, because if we knew with great certainty what was going to be the regional effect of climate change in 10 years in Pakistan, for instance, then the Pakistani government and other governments working together could more adequately adjust and mitigate those effects. But our models cannot give us those precise regional estimates. So that is a massive problem with the way that he's communicating here, and particularly the way he's communicating to a conservative audience. They're not going to get that little footnote at the end of his sentence where he says, climate models are not fit for purpose at the regional level, when the purpose is predicting the precise impacts of climate change at small regional levels. They're not going to get that. They're going to come away from that thinking, oh, well, the climate science is a bunch of bunk. The models are all garbage. We don't really know what the effect is going to be. Therefore, there really is no appreciable risk from continued greenhouse gas emissions. So let's not change the system. So that's a major problem with the way he's communicating that right there. Continuing on.
Change threaten world's food supply, United Nations warns. And here's unsettled agricultural yields have surged the past century, even as the globe has warmed. And projected price impacts of future human-induced climate changes through 2050 should hardly be noticeable among ordinary market dynamics, close quote.
Now, again, this is fundamentally just foolish. I can't think of a better word for it, or a more charitable way to interpret this. Yeah, agricultural yields have surged during the past century. Why is that? Because massive technological improvements have occurred in our understanding of how to manipulate plant growth by, phosphorus, nitrogen application, the whole green revolution, all the massive improvements in agricultural machinery. That's what has been causing the surge in agricultural yields. Also, improvements in seeds, etc. What he's trying to do here is say, well, the planet has been warming over the past century, and if it's a really simple linear relationship whereby as temperatures go up, agricultural yields go down, not thinking in terms of complex systems at all, just a pure linear relationship, well then, we don't really have to worry about agricultural yields in the future. And then the second part is projected price impacts should be hardly noticeable amid ordinary market dynamics. Again, we're going to the extremely flawed and powerfully critiqued neoclassical economic approaches to this question. I'm talking right now during a summer in which the Indian government has banned the export of non-basmati rice to the rest of the world because they're expecting a massive reduction in their rice crop yield, and they don't want to provoke social instability and political unrest by having a massive spike in domestic food prices. So they're going to cut off exports to the rest of the world, thereby contributing to higher prices in other countries. Now, this is, very early in the climate change as it unfolds, yet we're already seeing these kinds of impacts. If you blithely forecast from existing correlations between global average temperatures and crop yields, and then make your predictions of the next 50 years on that basis, again, thinking in linear terms, not complex system terms, you're going to be terribly confused on this issue, which Kunin evidently is. Okay, so let's move on to another point that he makes.
And you might ask, what's going to happen over the next 100 years as that warming happens? We can look at the past to get some sense of how we might fare. Okay, not perfect, but an indication. Since 1900 until now, the global population has gone up by a factor of 5. We're now at 8 billion people. The average lifespan or life expectancy went from 32 years to 73 years. The GDP per capita in constant dollars went up by a factor of 7. The literacy rate went up by a factor of 4. The nutrition, etc., etc. And we've seen the greatest flourishing of human well-being ever, even as the globe warmed by 1.3 degrees. And the kicker, of course, is that the death rate from extreme weather events fell by a factor of 50. Better prediction, better resilience of infrastructure, and so on. So to think that another 1.3 or 1.4, whatever degrees over the next century is going to significantly derail that beggars belief.
No, what really beggars belief is that someone as intelligent as this guy could think in such an absurd manner. And that's what makes me look at solution aversion as the only possible explanation for why he would think in this, I would think, so self-evidently illogical manner. So what he's saying is, again, similarly to what I showed you before, over the past century, we've seen all sorts of improvements. Because we've had massive technological advances. Humans all over the planet have been contributing in various ways to advances in technology, production, etc. And that is what explains how we have massive increases in life expectancy. We have better drugs, penicillin, vaccines, etc. We have the green agricultural revolution. We produce more food. All of these things have come as a result of technological improvements. And then what he's trying to do is say, well, look, the planet warmed by 1.1, 1.3 degrees over that century. If we're looking for a simple linear relationship between increases in global average temperatures and these various measurements of human thriving or how well we're doing, Well, we actually see a positive relationship. So therefore, we really don't have to worry about further increases in global average temperatures. That's just astoundingly bad reasoning. Uh, it's so linear. I struggle to understand, other than by solution aversion, why an otherwise intelligent person would make an error this glaring to me. Because thinking in this erroneous way is reassuring. It says we don't have to change our system very much at all. We can continue on business as usual, more or less, without risking very much at all. But the fundamental problem here is we're not dealing with linear relationships. We're dealing with a complex system. And in this complex system, everything that we know about even basic physics of how the greenhouse effects works, everything we know about the system is that you increase temperature, global average temperatures, and you see massive non-linear effects in different parts of the world. Much bigger droughts, much bigger floods, positive feedback loops, like when the permafrost in the northern parts of the climate melt and then release tons and tons of methane and even more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. We're not dealing with linear effects, so it's just risible, absurd to make an argument that because over the past century we've seen some warming, and nonetheless humans have continued to thrive and across a number of measures improve their lives. Therefore, if we go up another 1.3 or what have you degrees of warming, then we really shouldn't expect anything bad. If anything, using that logic, we should go 5, 6, 7 degrees. Because hey, if it's a causal relationship, again, a linear causal relationship, the world got hotter over the past 100 years. Well, let's make it even hotter, and then human thriving will go off the charts in the subsequent 100 years. Just really poor reasoning here. So here I want to get back a little bit into psychology. The last part of this video, they show results of a poll finding that the overwhelming majority of teenagers in the US have an accurate understanding of climate science and the high-end risks, real risks that we're running. One, that climate change will impact everyone in my generation, and very smartly, through global political instability. That's the real worry. Perhaps Kunin is not very much informed about politics, doesn't think very much about political economy, or hasn't read very much about it. The main worry is not the first order physical effects. From a climate scientist's view, an ecologist's view, that very well may be, because that's their focus of study. That's what they care about most, is keeping the natural system in which we live more or less the same, thriving. But for most of us, I think, the main thing that we have to worry about, or we do worry about, is political instability, the mass migrations, the social instability, which can lead to war and conflict and massive human suffering. That's the second order effects. The US Department of Defense, the Pentagon, has actually done really good analysis on this question, looking at not they also look at the first order physical effects, but they focus mostly on the second order political effects. That's what we're really worried about for the short, medium term. Long term, we've got a much broader range of worries. Secondly, they say that they find that the majority of teenagers in the US agree that if we don't address climate change today, it'll be too late for future generations, making some parts of the planet unlivable. Again, not a very controversial statement, but let's see how Kunin responds to this, and then we'll get into a little bit more of the psychological factors involved here.
Close quote. John Kerry, Al Gore, Greta Thunberg, and on and on and on. You've got countless voices warning that climate change represents a genuine danger to life on the planet. And now millions of young Americans are scared, really scared. Surely this has some role to play in what we see, the suicide societal ideation and the increasing unhappiness. I'm sure there are all kinds of, but surely this is part of what's going on.
There are two immoralities here. The one immorality is the treatment of the developing world, which we talked about already. The other immorality is scaring the bejesus out of the younger generation.
Okay, so first of all, I completely agree with this other Peter here that one of the factors behind the increases in suicide, depression, etc., is the recognition that we're playing chicken with our very climate. We're taking reckless risks in continuing to use the current form of economic organization we have with its energy use as already exists, and we're risking massive climate disruption that will likely lead to political instability, social breakdown in various parts of the world, and a lot of human suffering. So yes, of course, that is going to for the people who understand it, for the people who have learned about it, that is likely to contribute to depression. Absolutely. And that actually brings us to kind of the other end of the discussion we started with about solution aversion. So when you're faced with an idea, a proposition, an argument, what have you, that is in accord with what you already believe, what you feel is, oh, this doesn't offend me. This kind of fits. If anything, I have a kind of pleasant feeling about it. Also, if you're presented with something that is good news, somebody giving you reasons why you're very likely to succeed and have a very happy, wonderful life, you're going to feel good when you hear that. And everything else being equal, you're more likely to accept an argument, idea, proposition, etc., that makes you feel good versus one that makes you feel bad. I'm sure you can think of plenty of examples in your personal life. Perhaps you've had friends where you think that their romantic partner is not treating them very well, and you try to present the evidence that you see as making this very clear to them, but they really try to avoid it. They don't want to hear it. It makes them feel uncomfortable, so they seek to deny it. Well, that's the same basic psychological dynamic at play here. So if you give a whole bunch of people the idea, the proposition that climate science is basically wrong, that we're not running any major risks, and therefore we don't need to make any significant changes to the global economic system, that's going to make people feel less anxious. It's going to make them feel less bad than the contrary view, which is that we are running a massive existential risk that threatens this and future generations. That's going to cause distress, and everything else being equal, you're more likely to reject that solely on the basis of the negative feelings it provokes in you. Now, of course, nothing ever is all equal. Everything else is never all equal, right? And when people are presented with evidence, that can overcome motivated reasoning in the contrary direction. The evidence comprises what's called a knowledge constraint. That is, if we have this knowledge of solid evidence that we are running this massive risk, that is a knowledge constraint that prevents us from reasoning in the direction of our motivation towards a more pleasing conclusion. Lastly, he mentions in passing the inequity to the global south, something along those lines. Well, yeah, absolutely. But, the inequity towards the global south is kind of the name of history over the past, half a millennium or so. Nothing unusual there. What he's trying to say, though, is if we go away from fossil fuels, then global south countries are going to be starved of energy, and that's going to make them even poorer. Which, if that's what the proposition is, you're going to simply starve them of fossil fuels and not provide any alternative, then yes, absolutely, that will only increase immiseration and poverty. Of course, that's not what serious critics of the current system are calling for. They're not saying, let's just cut off the entire world from fossil fuels. They're saying we have to transition immediately, rapidly, to renewable energy. And the kind of eco-socialist or whatever wing you want to call it. I typically don't like these terms that kind of box people into a eco-socialist or degrowth or what are the other terms for different approaches to this. But the more intelligent way of looking at this is, yes, the rich countries need to be the ones investing in the development of renewable energy for the global south. And so the required transition to renewable energy would not be a matter of further immiserating global south countries. It would actually be a way of rectifying past injustices by transferring wealth in the form of technology, infrastructure, and energy to these poor countries. So he clearly doesn't understand that. He's just thinking the only possible alternative, at least insofar as this is concerned, is simply cutting off the world from fossil fuels without any compensatory investment by rich countries in poor countries to build the renewable energy infrastructure of the future. The next climate denial, a little harder, I guess, I want to show you, comes from someone whose background I don't really know very well. I would imagine perhaps an engineering background, background in investing in energy. But I'm going to start this time with a statement of his kind of ideology, his ideological prior beliefs. And then I'm going to get into the meat of his presentation. So here we go.
Just to why those things. I know, one of the most common questions. So, touring going to start already? Come on, first, optimism doesn't mean naivete or lack of realism. Optimism is born on the belief that we'll sort things out, and not that we naively can't Sovietize an economy. We know economies can be Sovietized and destroyed because the Soviets did that. And Russia's still in the shambles because of that. China's.
So he's stating clearly he's an optimist that we're going to get out of the ecological crisis that we're currently in, because we have, as a species, a track record of accomplishing pretty amazing things, technologically speaking, in terms of production, right? And then he says, well, we don't want to Sovietize our economy. And he's almost right in the words he's choosing to use here, because if you've heard the protest phrase, system change, not climate change, that gets at the very heart of it. That if we are going to reduce the risks that we face, the existential risks that we face, then we're going to have to change our economic system at minimum. It'll also have a lot of social and political effects as well, because it requires global cooperation, intergovernmental cooperation at an extent that we've never seen before. So he's saying here, we don't want to Sovietize our economy. He has a belief in free market capitalism as the best form of economic organization that has been invented or applied. And he doesn't want to shift to a different system that he calls a more Soviet system that involves, as a requirement, a much greater deal of government intervention in the economy, government planning. And he's saying, oh, this is, it would lead to terrible results. Like Russia is in a horrible state today because it Sovietized its economy. Well, here I kind of have to wince because he hasn't really read clearly much political economy or just history that covers economic issues about the Soviet Union and Russia. So the Soviet Union starts off where Russia is the most, or the least rather, economically advanced major country in Europe, starting from a very low level of sophistication, still largely a rural feudal economy with some industry in the cities, but that's a very small minority. And it engages in a massive transformative project of industrializing the country and actually reaches parity, in fact, pulls ahead of the US in certain things, like first manned mission to outer space comes from the Soviet Union. The degree of rapid industrialization that the Soviet Union accomplished is really remarkable, to the extent that in the 1950s you had conservatives in the US not making the standard argument that this guy is making here, which is the kind of socialist or Soviet system with a lot of government intervention, a kind of command economy, is just inherently a worse, more inefficient system, and capitalism is always superior at increasing production and stimulating technological development. No, in the 1950s, conservatives were saying, they were looking at the rapid industrialization that the Soviet Union was able to accomplish. Keep in mind, they beat Nazi Germany in World War II. Nazi Germany had, was a center of technological economic advance within the capitalist world. And a lot of people thought, oh, they're going to easily march over the Soviets because their economic system is inherently inefficient. It's a command economy. They're not going to be able to compete in producing military assets with the Germans. Well, we know how that worked out. They actually beat the Germans. Their system proved to be actually quite effective at mass industrial production of military assets, and then after the war, shifted to civilian production. So he's wrong on that. The fact that, or the assertion rather, that command economies or socialist economies are inherently inefficient. They certainly proved inefficient at some things, light industry and consumer good oriented industries. They definitely weren't able to keep up with capitalist countries in that kind of competition. Although if you want to look at a fuller picture, you would have to look at access to resources and on what terms. The capitalist world was able to have access to resources from the global south or developing world or underdeveloped world at concessionary prices, using their political power and influence to make sure that their corporations were able to get the resources on terms favorable to capitalist world industries from the developing world or the underdeveloped world or the global south, whatever you want to call it. So it's not really even that simple of a comparison, even on that light industry / consumer good comparison between the Soviet Union and the US. Leaving that aside, to say that then the Russian economy, excuse me, today is in the doldrums or is weak as a result of the Soviet era, that betrays an ignorance of Russian economic history in the 1990s, which saw a massive de-industrialization as the country shifted via so-called shock therapy to a kind of gangster form of capitalism. And a lot of the gangsters that took over control of formerly Soviet industry sold a whole lot of it off for scrap because they realized they couldn't compete with consumer-oriented industry in the West. But this is a clear indication that his belief system is one in which free market capitalism is the best form of economic organization, a more command-style economy, not just like the Soviet Union, but also like the United States economy during World War II. The period of World War II mobilization was very much, it involved a lot of command economy elements into the US economic system, with the government telling companies like Ford, guess what, guys? You're no longer going to be making a whole bunch of consumer cars. We need you to retool and build fighter jets or fighter planes and submarines, etc. That is an example of a command economy where the government is commanding production. He doesn't like that, and that is the precursor, the requirement for solution aversion to kick in here, because clearly he does not like the solution of having the government direct the transition to renewable energy. So you can kind of see the motivations here. Let me play another clip from this explaining his beliefs.
But when I write my books about politics, I sort of want to paint a picture of what the stakes are to get through. We want to unleash this kind of innovation, which you might imagine, I'm biased in this sense. The government's not really good at picking what's going to win or lose in innovation territory. So my political bias is to allow markets to function within the boundaries that we agree on, safety and environmental impacts, within reasonable boundaries, but let markets function. The more governments say this is what the market should do, the more we delay the growth and the closer we get to Sovietizing the economy, which would be bad.
So again, he views Sovietizing the economy as bad and wants free market capitalism to continue to reign. It's kind of, he's a little bit out of step with the kind of blob consensus in DC now when he talks about government is really bad at picking winners. Well, the US is engaging in a new round or a new form of industrial policy. It always had industrial policy in the form of the military industrial complex. So many of our innovations that we use today, including ones that I'm using right now to record this video and put it on the internet, come from DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration. That is US industrial policy. But over the past couple of decades, you've got so many people in the DC blob who have seen China, the Chinese government, do an excellent job of picking winners. Now, that's not to say it's a 100% success rate. Venture capitalists don't have a 100% success rate. There is always going to be bad bets or bad investments or bad decisions about where to command economic resources to produce this or that. Of course. But the record is that actually government picking winners oftentimes does work. And it's not just China, Japan, Korea. If you go back, Germany, US, France, England, during different stages of economic development, actually similar stages of economic development, but different parts of history. So he's inaccurate there, but you can see that his ideology is very clearly in favor of free market capitalism. So he views the solution to the threat posed by climate change or the broader ecological crisis as threatening to that belief. He doesn't want to give up the belief. So instead of giving up that belief, he attempts to reason around the evidence that we are running a massive, dangerous existential risk with the ecological crisis and continuing on with business as usual with our capitalist economic system. So in this presentation, this guy doesn't actually engage in a lot of specious arguments about climate science itself. Instead, what he's trying to do in this presentation is argue against the idea that we're already in this massive green transition, and the future most likely will be a continuation of that trend, and we're going to kind of evolve or develop into a renewable energy powered economy just if current trends continue. So his kind of like style or form of climate denial in this video is basically to say we're not doing what is required according to the climate consensus. We're not doing that. Also, there are some significant impediments to doing that within the current system, although he doesn't put it that way directly. Therefore, and this is the part where his argumentation is almost absent, but implicitly, therefore, climate change, the ecological crisis more broadly, is not a real significant threat. We don't have to worry about it. We can put our faith in technological advances, put our faith in human ingenuity that will find a way out of this mess. But he's very vague about precisely what that is compared to the alternative of massive government intervention, a kind of new World War II level mobilization for transitioning our economic system away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and moreover, changing a lot of other aspects of our production system, from getting rid of planned obsolescence, moving away from industrial agriculture to sustainable agriculture, all sorts of changes. Instead of making production location decisions, where you build factories to build stuff on the basis of labor arbitrage, that is, where you can find workers that you can pay very little so that they can produce things to sell in places where workers are paid a lot, so they have more purchasing power. Getting rid of all of that and shifting to a very different system. That he's clearly against, but he doesn't make a very clear argument against the climate science. It's more of an implicit argument because we're not making the transition. The transition sees massive impediments to occur under our current system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all of his slides, but instead of making the argument he's making with the evidence that he presents, I'm going to make an argument that's kind of equally well supported by the evidence he provides. But instead, what I'm going to be doing is arguing against a certain kind of green growth approach. Now, I said before, I don't like all of these terms. They bother me for a bunch of different reasons. One of them is just that there will be plenty of people who would say, I'm a proponent of green growth, but you're misrepresenting my position. That's completely true. There are lots of people who use that term to describe their thinking, but their thinking varies massively. What I'm trying to do here is use the evidence that he provides to argue against the belief that if we keep our current economic system, basically free market capitalism, that system itself is capable of producing the transition, the transformative change to our economic system away from fossil fuels to renewable energy that is required. And that instead, what is actually required is more like the World War II mobilization model, or as he would call, Sovietizing the economy. That is, a great deal of government intervention in the economy, building the renewable energy infrastructure, regulating companies, forcing companies to produce different sorts of things, just as happened in the United States during World War II. So basically, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use his evidence, which he used, to say, the climate change is not a big threat. There are massive impediments to addressing it. So let's just put our faith in human ingenuity and technology and go to sleep and don't make any big changes. Instead, I'm going to use that same evidence to show, yeah, there is a very big problem with the belief that we can continue on with the current economic system, but technological growth and market forces are going to be sufficient in driving us away from fossil fuel use toward renewable energy powered economy. And therefore, what we actually need to do is much more along the model of the United States experience during World War II, or more broadly, a kind of an economy which has many more aspects or influence from the command economy model, where the government is a major player and organizer within that economic system. So I'm just going to go through slide by slide and make this argument. So he points out that what are the sources of increased energy demand over the past few hundred years? It's innovations, it's inventions. The car drove a massive surge in energy demand. The airplane, modern pharmaceuticals require massive energy inputs to produce. Everything that the reason why we see massive increases in energy use is that we've developed machines that require the use of a great deal of energy. He'll point out later, the slide rather will point out later, that wealth, national wealth, is extremely closely correlated with energy usage, and it's for this basic reason. Nothing inaccurate there for sure. Next slide is this here, which shows the kind of adoption rate so far of electric vehicles. So this looks like pretty fast growth. According to this graph, it is. But he points out that in 1964, the Mustang saw much more rapid growth. And I think that was just in the US market or the North American market. And yeah, that is a fair point. This is reality. We have seen a pretty rapid growth in uptake of electric vehicles, particularly over the past couple of years with the rise of very successful electric vehicle manufacturers in China. The trend is probably going to continue, but let's move on to the next slide over here. He's basically pointing out that those who are saying We're on this extremely rapid trajectory. Capitalism as it is right now is going to foster the renewable energy transition on its own. He's basically saying, wait, it's not anywhere near as fast, even as the adoption of a sports car back in the 60s. Temper your expectations down a little bit. Then he points out that EVs, electric vehicles, are just a complexity swap. They're not less complex overall. They're much less complex in terms of the engine, but then in the fuel source, which in ICE cars, internal combustion engine cars, is a gas tank. That's really simple, but the energy source for EVs is this massively complex battery. Yeah, true, but it doesn't really get at the point of the argument people make when they look to, or they point out the greater simplicity of electric vehicles. They're pointing out that whereas ICE cars break down all the time and you have to take them to a mechanic because there's so many thousands of parts in an engine, one of which goes out and the whole engine stops working. Instead, with electric vehicles, you have a much simpler engine, many fewer parts overall in the car. So the experience of an owner of one of these two kinds of cars is going to find a much easier experience with an EV. Yeah, okay. He's technically right that, yeah, the battery is massively complex, so it is a kind of complexity swap, but that's irrelevant for the owner of the car whose experience is, I don't have to keep going in every X amount of time to get expensive repairs because my engine is so incredibly complex. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. So here he's saying the kind of conventional wisdom is that electric vehicles are the future. All technological advance is going to occur in the EV space, and ICE engines, internal combustion engines, are a thing of the past. And he's saying, well, there's still technological improvements that can be made to ICE engines. They can become more efficient. Okay, great, whatever. That's kind of irrelevant for the point I'm making. It's also somewhat speculative, but let's just take his assertion as true for the sake of the argument. Moving on. Then he points out, contra the kind of we can have green growth under capitalism view, we're not seeing consumers kind of act and make individual consumer choices in a way that's consistent with the understanding that we're in a extremely dire ecological crisis and we need massive system change. But, that is entirely the point people are making as to why we can't have the transformative changes that are required if we keep our system as is, as a more or less, quote unquote, free market capitalist system. So he's pointing out here the average size of new cars sold around the world is rising. That is exactly the opposite of what people would be doing if they were individually thinking we need to solve the ecological crisis by reducing carbon emissions. That's increasing carbon emissions. But that's precisely what the people who are arguing for system change, not climate change, have been pointing out, that individual consumer choices are meaningless. You're not going to get a system change by changing individual consumer behavior. It's just a total mismatch. It's a category error. So yeah, true. We've got this phenomenon of bigger and bigger cars being sold around the world. And in the US, despite all the talk about people moving more into cities or just doing remote work, people have, over the past few years, increased their driving distance, those who are living in suburban counties, that is. That's a problem. He even points out that a lot of this is driven by the fact that people can't afford housing in the urban areas in which they work. So they're forced to move further and further away, forcing them to have a longer and longer commute, driving more and more, emitting more carbon, simply because the housing market is fundamentally out of whack in the United States. It's a speculative market with far too many people viewing houses as just an investment, not a place to live. That's also what the system change, not climate change people are saying, that we can't rely on the current forms of marketplace organization that we have in place. We have to have a more planned economy, including when it comes to housing, to make housing affordable near where people work, and also overwhelmingly to make housing affordable in urban areas, because energy use tends to be lower in urban areas because your apartments are smaller than big suburban or exurban houses that need to be heated and cooled for a much larger space. You don't have to drive. In fact, you don't need a car in cities with good public transportation, etc. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide over here. Here he's going to be pointing out that you need far more raw materials to produce an electric vehicle than you do to produce a conventional car. Just the upfront production resource requirements. And that is because the batteries are massively heavy, extremely dense, and they require a hell of a lot of metals and minerals to produce. And if you compare that to a conventional car, electric cars require a multiple of the pounds of minerals and metals that a conventional car needs. Now, from the perspective of system change, not climate change, this is a serious concern. This is why the original Green New Deal proposal in the United States, what was that, some nearly a decade ago, actually, the Green Party proposed it even further ago, but I'm talking about in the 2016, 2017, 18, around then. The original idea was not a blueprint for a law. The original proposal was the first thing to do is to convene scientists of all sorts, engineers of all sorts, together to hammer out a blueprint. And they would be tasked with things like creating as complete an assessment as possible of existing stores of the required minerals and metals around the world, the cost of accessing them, of mining them, etc., transporting them. That was why the original Green New Deal proposal was so necessary, so essential, because that kind of work, doing a full accounting of the resources that we have access to on this planet, comparing that with the projected resource requirements for a green transition, that is absolutely essential. And it could very well be that we simply do not have the resource requirements for replacing the entire fleet of the world's cars from ICE engines to electric engines. That could very well be. If that's the case, then we have to do even greater restructuring in terms of our transportation systems. More focus on urban living versus rural and suburban living, which require more personal vehicles, perhaps shifting to a more ride-share system. But nonetheless, all of that would require even greater transformation of our economic system. If we find that we do have sufficient real resources to replace all existing cars, and perhaps even going further, produce even more cars, because there are many people around the world that simply don't have the effective demand, the money to buy their own car, but would want to. Well, that's another question. Do we have the resources required for that, for replacing all existing cars, or even producing a greater number of cars for those around the world who currently don't have a car but would need one? Another issue is the way that we produce these cars. Right now, everything that's produced around the economy is produced with planned obsolescence in mind. You, as a competitive capitalist in this system, do not want to produce products that have too long of an effective lifespan. Why? Because then you don't have repeat customers. You sell something to one customer and they don't come back to you for 50, 60 years. That's not good in the capitalist form of economic organization. Hence, planned obsolescence was developed. The design of products with the intent that they will break down after a certain period of time, so then your customer has to come back to you and buy a replacement. That's something we cannot afford, but that's also directly related to this real resource constraint. Do we have enough of these natural resources to produce what amount of cars? And how do we design them such that the longest possible lifespan is aimed at in the engineering process, rather than a shorter lifespan so that customers come back? Just as a quick aside, I was in Scotland visiting a distillery whiskey distillery. And they showed this machine for, I think, taking the husk off of the barley. And they said this machine is some 110, 120 years old. Everyone there was kind of shocked, like, wow, this machine is still, you're still using this exact same machine? They said, yeah, it was so well built, we're continuing to use it. We have to do repairs every now and then, but it's an extremely well built machine. It'll continue on probably for another 50, 100 years. And then they pointed out the company that made this machine went bankrupt. And why did it go bankrupt? Precisely for the same reason that planned obsolescence developed in the first place, because they didn't have enough repeat customers coming back because their machine was just too damn good. It was too sturdy. You didn't need to replace it every 4 years. These are all issues that would need to be sorted out by a diverse group of scientists and engineers to plan a green transition, which was precisely what the original Green New Deal proposal called for. That's an open question, and it's actually a very helpful of this guy to bring it up. But of course, he's bringing it up for different purposes under different assumptions. His assumption is that the current capitalist economic system would be basically unchanged. Then he says, when we look at emissions and compare ICE engine cars to electric engine cars, we've got to look at the total emissions, not just the emissions when you're driving from point A to point B, but the emissions that are baked into the production of the car. So he points out, because EVs are so much heavier, because they require so many more metals and minerals, the emissions that are required to extract those resources from the earth, break them down, purify them, put them into the form that they will be useful to make a battery. There's a hell of a lot of emissions in all of these processes. So it's only after many years or tens of thousands of miles or kilometers driven that you start to see a difference in carbon emissions between EVs and standard cars. Absolutely, it's naive to think that you get your new EV without any emissions occurring in the production of that car, and the only emissions you need to worry about are the emissions caused by you actually using the car. Absolutely fair and accurate point. Moving on, then he says that there's a bunch of different factors here, even involved in when you're looking at the emissions from using the car to drive. And that is absolutely accurate as well. And a lot of people who favor the system change, not climate change perspective are 100% open about this and talk about this a lot. That if you're plugging in your EV in a country or a place, a location where the electricity overwhelmingly comes from coal, then your driving emissions are probably still going to be lower than an ICE engine car, simply because electric engines are intrinsically more efficient at converting the stored energy into used energy than ICE engines. But the efficiency gains, or the carbon emission reductions, are going to be a lot less when you're plugging in your car and the grid you're in is using coal versus wind or solar. Absolutely fair and accurate point. Moving on, his next graph here is saying, well, there are all of these variables in the emissions required to extract the minerals and metals that we need. Those emissions might go up as it becomes more difficult to obtain those minerals, those metals from the soil. You have to go to mines, locations that require more energy use just to get the minerals to transform into batteries. Other variables are, what are the energy sources being used to power the grid that you're using to recharge your car? But then in this graph, he's basically showing in the green line the worst case scenario where every time you plug in your car, it's coming directly from a coal-fired power plant. The emissions required to extract the minerals used to make the batteries is at the highest possible point. And then the ICE possible line is kind of like the best case scenario for continued technological improvements in ICE engines, internal combustion engines, And so it's kind of an unfair comparison, but nonetheless, the fundamental points he's calling attention to are accurate and worth considering. That when we're thinking about total emissions for electric vehicles versus ICE vehicles, you've got to look at the full picture, including production and where is your electricity that you're plugging your car into to recharge it coming from. So yeah, absolutely fair point. Although he's kind of tipping the scales here by using the kind of worst case scenario in the green for EVs and the red, the best case scenario for ICE engines. But let's leave that aside. Moving on, next slide. So here he's showing data on how year over year, as we exploit the easiest to access copper ore, the copper ore that's closest to the surface, the most concentrated, cheapest to take out of the earth and refine and make into usable copper. As that gets exploited, we're left with harder and harder to access sources of copper. So then the expense of pulling that copper and other minerals out of the ground increases. And of course, at the same time, because part of that expense is the cost of energy, your energy use, hence emissions, goes up as the best sources of copper get used up, and you have to go to worse and worse, lower quality sources of copper. That goes across the board for any mineral or metal you need to build an EV. That's perfectly accurate, and that's another reason why it was so important to have that Green New Deal convening of a massive variety of scientists, engineers, people, investors even, who have experience in building mines, etc. That's why it was so important to get them together, to get to produce basically an analysis that would give us the best available collection of information about the resource availability, cost of accessing these resources, to give us a sense of what our real resource budget is for the green transition. If our resource budget is lower than we would like, then we simply cannot do the transition of all existing ICE cars to electric vehicles unless and until we can make electric vehicles with batteries with much lower resource requirements. However, if that process resulted in a finding that the available resources we have on Earth are more than sufficient to do that, then we could say, yes, absolutely, we can transform the existing fleet, and perhaps we could even expand dramatically the number of total cars on Earth so that people who don't have access to cars because they lack the effective demand, the money, could actually get it. But that's an open question. Moving on to the next slide. Of course, there's the issue of temperature. If you're living in the northern reaches of Canada or Russia, and you have extremely low temperatures in the winter, then your electric vehicle battery is not going to do as well. It's not going to pump out as much energy for you to use to travel as you would living in another climate. Absolutely, that's certainly a problem for people living in colder climates. That, again, would be an excellent thing for a panel of scientists and engineers convened by that Green New Deal legislation to discuss, to figure out how to address this challenge for people living in northerly climates. Moving on to the next. Then he's saying that technological progress in battery development has not been anywhere near as fast as technological progress in semiconductor development, computer processors. Okay, sure, absolutely. That's the reality. What he's using that for is basically to argue against kind of these wide-eyed optimist views of, we can keep the current capitalist system. The transition is just going to happen on its own through individual consumer decisions and investor decisions. And so therefore, don't need to worry about anything, don't need any government intervention. He's actually using this data to argue against that view. What I'm saying here is, yes, absolutely, we do not see the kind of insanely rapid technological advance that we see in processors, that we see in battery development. that's a real resource constraint. That's a real technology constraint. So that is, again, something for that Green New Deal convening of scientists and engineers to include in their planning for the green transition. Moving on to the next slide here. This is just showing that it requires a hell of a lot of energy to ensure that electric vehicle recharging stations set up all over a country can actually provide the energy that they need to provide. It's having some trouble loading here. Here we go. So it's showing the megawatts required to power a large industrial plant, a small town, an outdoor stadium, and a large passenger or truck stop is going to need a massive amount of energy to be able to transfer that energy to individual trucks, individual drivers, etc. Well, yes, exactly. That's the sort of thing that Green New Deal panel of scientists and engineers would need to focus on. Moving on, but he's positing this as a reason why we're not going to get the kind of renewable energy fueled economy via natural market processes, and I couldn't agree more with him on that. It's just on the conclusions about what we should do as a result of that. That's where we differ. Then he says, it's not actually cheaper. Renewable cars are not actually cheaper than ICE cars for the user. Once you factor in things like, he says, well, insurance can be higher, is trending higher, because when you get in a car accident, it's harder to fix the car just at a mechanic shop because the battery is so complex. You basically have to scrap it and get a new car. So insurance companies are raising their premiums. He points that out. He says depreciation is higher because consumers think that, why would I get a used electric vehicle? Because, in a year from now, the next model is going to be 10 times better. And then he says, oh, well, we also have to account for the time value, the monetary value of time. It takes longer to recharge an electric vehicle than it does to fill up a gas tank. So if you include all of that, it's a higher cost for consumers. Okay, well, assuming all of his data is 100% true, it doesn't really change the important takeaway here, because it's not about individual consumer change. It has to be the required transition, system change, not climate change, has to be a government-led process, very much like the World War II era mobilization of the US or basically any other country involved, with a lot of command economy elements. So this is, kind of beside that point. Moving on to the next slide over here, there are a lot of multi-car households in the US. He's using this to show, hey, consumers aren't acting like they're really concerned about the climate crisis. And the people in favor of system change, not climate change, would say, you're absolutely right. That is a problem. That's why we're not arguing for individual consumer choices. That's why we're not arguing to keep the same free market capitalist economic system. That's why we're arguing for system change. That's why we're arguing for World War II style mobilization effort with massive levels of government involvement in planning and coordination with other governments, rather than just, individual consumer changes. Then he says, you also have to look at the increase in cost. So he mentioned before that as the easiest to access mines are used up, the locations on Earth where the minerals and metals we need to build EV batteries, as those are exploited and go empty, the remaining areas, locations where you can access these minerals and metals become, it's lower quality. It's a lower quality location. It's harder to get to. It requires more expense. It requires more energy to access. And of course, then that is going to feed into the cost of these raw materials. So he's basically trying to argue here that, yes, currently the cost of solar and wind is lower than the cost of energy from fossil fuel sources, thanks in large part to massive government intervention by the Chinese government to subsidize those industries in China. But he's saying, well, if the raw materials of those forms of energy production go up, then the cost of those sources of energy will go up too. Well, absolutely, but that just goes back to what I was saying about the problem with resources. That's why we need, still today, that Green New Deal panel of scientists and engineers to analyze and produce as comprehensive as possible an accounting of our resource budget. Forget about our monetary budget. That's a confusing veil. People assume that our monetary budget or financial budget is the exact same thing as our resource budget. No, finance, money is a technology we use. It does have lots of flaws. Things are not priced. The accounting that is used to produce our financial figures is not comprehensive enough. It doesn't include things that cannot be priced. There's a long list of reasons, but the fundamental point is we need a accounting of our resource budgets. Forget about the monetary budgets. We need the accounting of our resource budgets. And that this graph, this piece of data goes directly to that point as well. Moving on to the next slide. He says, okay, now he's kind of drifting into more of a critique of, again, the kind of wide-eyed, we can keep our wonderful capitalist system and technology is just kind of going to change everything. We're going to have this amazing renewable green energy economy with incredible innovations. And he's saying, you know, these innovations are still going to require increases in energy use. It's not like it's going to be a matter of reducing energy use. I don't think he mentions this directly, but there's a concept, a very old concept in economics, actually from a neoclassical economist, an early neoclassical economist, called the Jevons paradox, after William Jevons, who said basically we've got this paradox where as we develop new technologies that use less energy, you might think that as a result, overall energy use would go down. You have more efficiency, why wouldn't energy use go down? But he says the apparent or the seeming paradox is that as energy costs go down because so many things are more efficient, the use of cheaper things goes up. So even as technologies get more efficient and require less energy use, because that reduces the cost of energy, the usage of energy ends up going up. And that's that the Jevons paradox has been in evidence since then. We've seen precisely that. We've seen increases in efficiency, but also increases in energy usage. So he makes that point across a number of slides here, pointing out that, again, you know, if you think that drones are a kind of magic technology that are going to massively reduce the amount of energy that we need to use, that's not accurate. You're dealing with the same basic physical constraints. You need to use a lot of energy to move something, especially a heavy something, from point A to point B, and there's really no way around that. Then he points out, okay, robots are another area. Robots require energy. The more that we automate production using robots, we're going to increase our energy use, not decrease it. It might look like production is more efficient, but it's also going to require a greater use of energy. He points out that this is also the case in computing, that we've seen massive advances in computational power, but that also comes along with increases in energy usage. And with the cloud and AI, we expect to see further exponential growth in both computing power and energy usage. This next slide, economics of transportation sources. Yeah, you know, you can go much further today for the same dollar cost, but for those, you know, insofar as we're concerned about the ecological crisis, dollar costs aren't really the thing that we're concerned about. It's more the energy usage and the carbon emissions as a result of travel. And then, you know, all the data centers that are going to be built to handle the requirements of AI and cloud computing. There's going to be a hell of a lot of these data centers, and they're extremely high energy users. So he's using this to say, hey, we can have capitalism, the natural workings of the market and technological advancement is going to usher in this green fossil fuel free future. He's saying the evidence doesn't back that up, and the system change, not climate change people would say, yeah, you're right about that part. We just differ in terms of our conclusions or takeaways from that accurate observation. Moving on, this is showing again the massive increases in computing power, but just as the Jevons paradox would predict, just because our computing power is increasing, so individual processors are far more efficient, doesn't mean our energy use is going down. In fact, our energy use is going up because we find more and more uses for these massive data centers, more and more uses for AI, etc. So another illustration of the Jevons paradox at work. Moving on here to the next slide. Okay, sorry about this delay. Let's see what's going on. Okay, here we go. Here's a really key bit of information or evidence. So this is basically showing that a lot of past projections on the left side graph, this looks like it's mostly from politicians. So, I think people already take them with not a grain of salt, but a fistful of salt. But his point here is that all of these past predictions from politicians about the rate of growth in renewable energy have proven wrong thus far. So, why would we expect current projections to be correct? Current similar projections that say, oh, we're going to have this incredible growth in renewable energy usage. And to that, those of us on the system change, not climate change side say, yes, that is entirely the point. What we've been arguing is that the current economic system in which we are enmeshed or trapped for structural reasons is incapable of producing the transformation that we require to avoid the existential threats, risks that we face. So he's saying, the kind of current system is not going to produce what wild-eyed techno-optimists say, because thus far it hasn't. And the system change, not climate change, says, yes, absolutely. That is why we need system change, because we're not going to get the required transformation under the present form of economic organization. Okay, so moving on then to the next slide here. He points out that the current green transition, or the current transition to renewables taking place under the same old free market capitalist system is a massive disappointment. That renewable energy still makes up a relatively small fraction of overall energy use. I don't know if this is for the US or for Europe or for the whole world. I doubt it's for the whole world. But whatever the case is, he points out that even when you drill down into renewable energy use, a massive proportion of that is not really what people think of as renewable. When people think of renewable energy, they're thinking solar, wind, geothermal, tidal energy, not burning wood. But I was shocked to find this out several years ago. The EU likes to, brag about the extent to which they use renewable energy. But when you actually look at what comprises their renewable energy use, this is a couple of years old now, but I doubt it's changed rapidly since then. Nearly 2/3 of what the EU is calling renewable energy use was biofuels, which is predominantly wood. So burning trees. He points this out, and that's an important point, which the system change, not climate change people point out, because they're saying it's completely illogical to expect our current form of economic organization to produce the transformative change that we need. And just look at how slowly we're transitioning to renewable energy. And furthermore, even in that slow progress, a lot of that renewable energy is just burning wood, so it doesn't really deserve to be called renewable energy at all. Again, that's why we need system change. Then he says, wow, if we look at the projections of the amount of renewable energy infrastructure, renewable energy production that we need to transition away from fossil fuels and reduce our carbon emissions, that is going to require a massive amount of funding. Now, again, here, this is why I was mentioning earlier, we do not need to do a financial accounting. We need to do a real resource accounting. And I tell people, students this all the time. Don't think like an accountant or an economist or most politicians who think in financial terms. Think like a military planner. Think like a general. General's not going to think, do we have the money for this or that in the country to buy this or that? They're thinking, do we have access to the resources we need? And they'll break down the actual resources, the oil, the gasoline, the resources used to make bombs, bullets, metals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Think like that. So yes, it will require a massive amount of resources and labor. You can think of that in financial terms as well. I just prefer to think of it in resource terms because that's what's more directly relevant. But yeah, if you want to think of it in financial terms, it's going to require a massive financial investment. And he uses this to argue that we're not seeing it. It's politically very difficult to convince voters to approve of this. All true presently. But again, the system change, not climate change, people would say, yes, we are facing such a massive challenge, and that is precisely why we need a transformation in our current system of economic organization, and nothing else will suffice. Individual consumer choices, not going to suffice. The normal workings of the market, investors investing in renewable energy because they see it as short or medium-term profitable, not going to suffice. And that's this graph illustrates that in a way pretty well. Then he looks at German electricity or energy usage, finds that they have built out a lot of wind and solar resources, but the way that it's actually used in the energy system, the energy grid that Germany uses, preference is still given to fossil fuel sources and to a lesser extent, nuclear power. But again, this goes right back to the system change, not climate change argument. The reason why they're calling for such a transformative change to the economic system is that you can't do it little step by step piecemeal. It's add a little bit of solar there, add a little bit of wind there, add a little bit of extra transmission wires. It has to be planned. You have to think about, how are you going to deal with intermittency? Is it going to be with battery storage? And then you get right back to the issue of real resource constraints. Do we have the resources available to use battery storage as our main source of energy during intermittent times when the sun isn't shining, the wind isn't blowing? Or are we going to do it via ultra high voltage transmission lines, a massive network of them, not just country by country, but globally, internationally, so that areas of the planet that are not inhabited, take the Sahara Desert, are constantly they constantly have the capacity to produce massive amounts of electricity through wind and solar, and then transport that electric energy to other parts of the world where those renewable forms of energy are not currently available because it's not windy, not sunny, etc. Again, that's why planning is required. That's why system change is required. The next slide. Yeah, so this goes to the issue of intermittency. And if you're going to rely on battery storage, you're going to need a whole hell of a lot of battery capacity, which has, he focuses here on the slide on the financial aspect, the financial cost. But I would focus more on the resource cost. Do we have the required resources? I'm agnostic on that. I don't know. That is precisely why we need still today that Green New Deal convening of a panel of scientists and engineers to have a complete accounting of our available resources and our requirements for different plans, whether it's all battery or massive overcapacity in terms of the total possible capacity of all of our wind and solar, with ultra high voltage transmission lines crisscrossing the world to bring power from where it's being produced to where it's needed. That's a question that that panel would be tasked with answering. Moving to the next slide. I guess that's still the same. Next slide here. Again, this is the issue of intermittency, the size of the grid you would need. Yes, like I just said, you would need a much bigger grid and a great deal more overcapacity in your solar and wind assets, your solar and wind, the wind turbines, the panels, etc. If you don't have storage. If you do have storage, you can get by with a relatively smaller grid. Again, that's not for this guy or me to pronounce definitively on. That's for a panel of a diverse assortment of scientists and engineers to sort out. Moving on. Next slide. Okay, just getting back into cost of minerals, but this really, much more importantly, is an issue of the availability of minerals. Do we have these real resources on planet Earth in such locations that we can access them at a non-prohibitively high cost in energy terms, not in financial terms? But nonetheless, another important question which needs that panel of scientists and engineers to figure out. This is U.S. federal mine approvals. He's saying we're not seeing the kinds of investments in mines that would be required if we are going to have this massive green transition. And again, system change, not climate change, people would say, that is precisely the problem. If you have this decentralized free market capitalist system, you don't have the degree of intelligent, rational planning that is required in an emergency situation, whether it be the current emergency situation of the ecological crisis, or if it is the United States back in the 40s, where the emergency situation was World War II. Here we go. I mentioned this earlier. There is an incredibly close correlation. I think it's above 0.9 between GDP per capita and energy usage. And you can extrapolate from this further and say kind of differential access to energy is a big part of the wealth gap around the world. And if we want to improve the living conditions of the majority of the planet that are non-rich, living in non-rich countries, then their energy use is going to have to increase. For myriad reasons, to produce all of the goods that they need but don't have access to produce the medicines that they need and don't have access to build better housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, down the road. All of that requires energy. So he's pointing out, well, energy requirements are going to keep going up. Right now, we don't have enough renewable energy to fulfill those needs. The private marketplace is not investing sufficiently in that. Therefore, there is no problem. Go to bed, relax. Well, I struggle with the last leap of logic there, but I think it's entirely understandable from a solution aversion perspective. The alternative solution offered by those in the system change, not climate change camp requires a lot of government planning, government intervention in the economy, and intergovernmental cooperation. To those for whom that idea is anathema, to those for whom that idea conflicts sharply with their ideology, they are going to be motivated to find any possible way to believe that the ecological crisis is not a crisis at all. And that is a major problem and a major cause of climate denialism, whether it be soft forms where you say, well, yes, climate change is a massive problem, the ecological crisis is a crisis, but we really don't need to engage in any sort of transformative change. Slight piecemeal change will work just fine. Or if it's hard climate denialism, where you say, wow, whoops, sorry, hold on, let me fix this. So as I was saying, on the hard climate denial side, you have people believing that all of climate science is just bunk. We are not in a crisis at all. Therefore, we don't need to do anything. And in both sides, the soft and the hard denialists, they are averse to the required solution, and instead of transfer or taking that aversion, that negative emotional affect, that negative feeling, and applying it to try to come up with a better solution, instead it tends to change our evaluation of the evidence of the problem. And that, of course, is a massive problem in itself, because we're not going to get the global transformation we need to have a sustainable civilization and not run massive risks of extremely dangerous threats becoming real, manifest, unless we first recognize the crisis that we're in and then focus on affecting the solutions. So that might have gone a little bit longer than I expected. I hope that was useful for you to get this idea from political psychology about solution aversion, see how it is instantiated in the thinking of kind of a form of soft denialism, a form of hard climate denialism, and hopefully that will illuminate this phenomenon and perhaps even help you in your conversations with other people when you're trying to organize, get people on board with a political project to affect the required systemic transformation. That's it for me. Thanks for listening. Bye.